Now we come to what's known as the Nanjing Decade, usually seen as 1927 to 1937, the 10 years after which Chiang Kai-shek has managed to establish a new national capital in the south, even though he only has nominal authority on paper over the former Qing Empire. His actual real authority is really only in the Yangtze River Delta area. Nevertheless, all the warlords had paid lip service that this is the new capital. It's no longer in Beijing. It's in the south, in Nanjing. He's got about 10 years. He didn't know he only had 10 years, of course, until we have the Japanese invasion of China. So the question is, what was Chiang Kai-shek and the Nationalist Party able to accomplish? What were their goals? What were they trying to do before basically the Japanese invasion sort of messed up all of their plans? Now, we know with the hindsight of history, we know that Chiang Kai-shek's going to lose. He's eventually going to have to tuck tail and flee to Taiwan, and his party loses the mainland. However, it's important to understand before the destruction of the Nationalist Party that occurred over the course of World War II and the Civil War with the Chinese Communists, that things looked quite differently. And it was actually a fairly optimistic period in which many people thought, hey, the Nationalist Party is slowly achieving its goals. Our ideal future is still very far away, but hey, there are some positive developments here. We're making tangible, revolutionary progress. So, the Nanjing Decade. You've got a new capital, Nanjing, a new government, the nationalist-led government that all the warlords had paid lip service to, even though most of them are still completely autonomous from it. And you have a new economic alliance. This is a very interesting aspect of the Nanjing Decade, is that Chiang Kai-shek needs to have a mutually beneficial relationship with a Western, with a strong industrial power that doesn't necessarily have the predatory imperialist undertones to it that all other relationships have. I mean, you can have substantive relationships with the British, with the Japanese, but you're always afraid of what their ulterior motives are. What are they really going to do? If they get too much influence, they're going to completely undermine your government and take a chunk of China away from you. The Germans. The Germans are the ideal economic partner in the interwar period between World War I and World War II, because the Germans are a Western industrial powerhouse. In the 1930s, they're actively sort of in a wartime economy, industrializing with the aim of rearming their state under the Nazis. They're a Western industrial powerhouse who has been stripped of all international colonial territories and thus poses no political threat to China. And at this time period, what you get is you get a very profitable relationship for both Chiang Kai-shek's new government and for the Germans as well, before the Germans eventually decide to side with the Japanese as the stronger empire during World War II. Chiang Kai-shek's goals during the Nanjing Decade are to chip away slowly at warlord autonomy in the provinces, avoid full-on confrontation with Japan, like Yuan Shikai realized that would be political suicide before you're ready to actually defeat them. In the meantime, destroy the Chinese Communist Party because they are seen as an internal cancer of the body, much more dangerous than foreign imperialists. We have to have internal unity first. So, in order to, one of the best ways to achieve these goals is to have a profitable economic relationship with Germany. And so what you get is both sides are getting what they want out of this relationship. Germany is sending over advisors, military advisors, mineral prospecting advisors, helping to fund factories. And in exchange for China's raw resources, oftentimes minerals that will be turned into industrial munitions back in Germany, China in turn is getting the finished product of those factories to rearm for their future confrontation with Japan. During this time period, German military advisors are training Nationalist Party troops. They're advising the best way to encircle and destroy the Chinese Communist Party, which has retreated to the countryside. The Nationalist Party is buying planes. They even buy a submarine, I believe, at this point. Tanks. They're getting good armaments. There's tangible progress. The German advisors themselves say, in the mid-1930s, Chiang Kai-shek's armies are only a few years away from being able to defeat a Japanese army that invades China. In the meantime, before that happens, Chiang Kai-shek says, well, if I can't fight Japan yet, whenever that day comes, in the meantime, I'm going to destroy the CCP. The Chinese communists have to go. They're a cancer of our internal body politic. And the Germans eventually say, you know what, I've seen your ineffective attempts to try to destroy the Chinese communists. You go out, you destroy one base, and then you let them run away. We're going to teach you how to encircle it, to set up a cordon net in which they can't escape, and you can crush them once and for all. That finally succeeds in 1934, although it does have one tiny little outlet, and a few thousand CCP members manage to avoid detection and death and escape, and they go on what is known as the Long March. Now, the Long March will later be held up by Chinese communists after they take power in 1949 as sort of the most glorious, heroic era of their entire history. At the time it actually happened, 1934 to 1935, the Long March was the low point of Chinese Communist Party history. They'd been driven out of the cities. That's where the proletariat, Marxist revolution, communist revolution is supposed to take place. It's supposed to take place in the cities. You're not even in the cities anymore. You're in the countryside among the peasants. Southern landlords are very strong and powerful. They're not making much headway in the southern lands at all. And now you've been driven out of the southern countryside, and now you're in sort of the southwestern, western portion of China, in the most poor, oftentimes minority, non-Chinese lands of the modern Chinese state as well. It looked like the Chinese communists were on the verge of total destruction. All right. However, they do march, thousands of miles. During the march, it does lead to the rise of Mao Zedong and his marginalizing of Chinese Marxist intellectuals who had been educated in Moscow and had the blessing of the Soviet Union, all right, of Stalin. So these are Chinese Marxists who nonetheless are more loyal to Stalin than they are to the Chinese Communist Party. And Mao Zedong represents sort of your homegrown Chinese nationalist with a communist veneer. And he uses the Long March as his opportunity to seize power, sideline the Chinese-sent intellectuals from Moscow as out of touch with China's realities, and says, we're going to start the revolution in the countryside. They end up in 1935 in a poor, barren land known as Yan'an. In 1935, north-central China in the province of Shanxi, north of Xi'an, very poor, not a very promising area. It seems as though, despite later bluster and whatnot, it seems as though it's only a matter of time until the CCP and Mao are going to be utterly destroyed, if not for Japan's intervention. Japan's invasion of China will save the CCP from almost certain eventual destruction in Yan'an in the late 1930s. Now, meanwhile, Chiang Kai-shek is saying, he's not just like, oh, a few of them got away, they're all going to die. No, he continues to pursue them. During the Long March, they have flyovers, they're shooting at them, they're pursuing them. They know that they took eventual refuge in Yan'an, and Chiang Kai-shek is getting ready to wage one of the final attacks on the CCP in Yan'an in 1936. Meanwhile, however, he's going to get sidetracked and sidelined by Japanese imperialist activities in northeastern China. Rewind a few years, in 1931, the Japanese took over Manchuria, the northeastern huge chunk of China, and in 1932 turned it into the puppet state of Manchukuo. This was a serious blow to Chiang Kai-shek's political legitimacy and claim to being the rightful defender of Chinese sovereignty and territory and all of that. He's experiencing the same problem that the Qing dynasty and Yuan Shikai had before him. If you can't face up and defeat the foreign imperialist in battle, your political legitimacy gets eroded, your domestic enemies take that as an opportunity to attack you, and you're only 2 steps away from a fall from political grace. What's he going to do, though? Just like the Qing dynasty and Yuan Shikai, you can't fight the foreign imperialists yet. You're not strong enough. You will lose. So it's lose-lose for these guys. Chiang Kai-shek now has had the biggest insult. They've actually taken a chunk of our territory. Manchuria is huge. It's like 1/6 the territory of China, the Republic of China. That looks terrible. He has constant critics who are saying, you need to fight Japan, fight Japan. Chiang Kai-shek is worried he's going to get overthrown, a coup in his own party to sideline him because he's not fighting Japan because he knows he can't. This all comes to a head in 1936. Chiang Kai-shek goes to the city of Xi'an, south of Yan'an. He is there to negotiate, talk with local leaders about what the next step is going to be in exterminating the Chinese communists from their rural, poverty-stricken base in Yan'an. And suddenly he finds that he is kidnapped by his own officers, who basically tell him, we need to fight Japan. We can't afford to not fight Japan anymore. You need to stop going after the Chinese communists. Chiang Kai-shek says we're not ready to fight Japan. It'll be suicide. But this is how this all comes to a head, right? Same problem that previous leaders had found. And they kidnap him. And he's not going to be released until he agrees to enter into a second coalition with the CCP and fight against the Japanese. Okay? And this eventually will lead to the fateful decision to confront the Japanese the next time that they conduct an imperialist military aggressive outrage in China. That's going to occur in 1937 around Beijing, and that's when Chiang Kai-shek from his southern base in Nanjing and Shanghai is going to say, okay, we have to fight. Or I'm going to get kidnapped again. I've already been kidnapped once. I can't no longer fight Japan. Whatever we've gotten with our German alliance, our German trained armies, our German armaments, let's put them into battle. And you have the beginning of World War II in East Asia.